Welcome to Talkin' Mets with Rob. Subscribe to the channel for all your New York Mets in-game live, pre-game, post-game, round-table podcast, and all the breaking news for our New York Mets. Enjoy the show and let's go Mets.
City lights in the dead of night, full of echo. Concrete jungle, dreams bust to grow. Mets in the air, chase glory, no fear. Broken backs, but hearts steer clear. OMG, the chaos, what a scene. Streets buzzing like a machine. Grimace from the shadows, chills on my spine. Past haunts, the future shine. Come back to the night, keep dreams alive. Fighting tooth and nail just to survive. City's heartbeat echoes in our chant. Grit and glory is all we want. Brooklyn to Queens, hear the roar. From laughter to blood in every scar. Living legends made on this ground. From silence we scream, make a sound. Rising high, falling low, repeat again. Cycles of the game, addicted to the pen. Graffiti tales spray on the wall. Met saga, forever stand tall. Rivals smear, but we push on through. Every heartbeat bleeds, orange and blue. Grimace fades, turn into a storm. In the Mets family, we are reborn.
What's up, Mets fans? Welcome back to Mets Talk Live right here on the channel and on X. All right, Mets fans. So one day after the New York Mets were eliminated in the NLCS, we get to talk about it a little bit more. We're going to talk about a lot of things that went wrong in the NLCS. We're going to talk a little bit about the games. And, go through the free agent list. I'm not going to talk about keeping them or, letting them go or anything like that. It's just an overview of the day after your season is over. And it, again, we have to talk about what we've been talking about in the chat. The Mets were big underdogs in 2015 versus the Dodgers and the Cubs. No, they weren't. They were not. The Mets had home field advantage in 2015 against the Cubs. They had the better record. The Dodgers, they didn't have the better record, right? It wasn't huge underdogs. This Dodger team was a lot better in 2024 than it was in 2015. Look at that 2015 Dodger team. It was a bunch of older, veteran guys that were nearly over the hump. Right? It wasn't the same. It's not a team like the Dodgers here. That was a team that spent money on a ton of older veterans that were on their last leg in 2015. They weren't as good as 2024. And the fact that the Mets never had home field advantage in this playoffs, they beat two division winners in the NLCS. In the playoffs. And they lost to the best team in baseball. The Dodgers are the best team in baseball in the NLCS, then they took them to Game 6. So if you don't believe, and you talk about luck explosive, that's fine, right? It takes luck for all the teams to do what they did, right? But the Yankees going to the World Series, did they get a lot of luck facing two very, very mediocre teams in the ALDS and the ALCS? right? That's luck, right? They didn't have to face the Astros. They didn't have to face anybody who was any good. They faced Kansas City, who is mediocre at best, and Cleveland, who was mediocre at best as well. The flaws were obvious, right? The AL Central was always a division that was a problem. And that's fine, right? You talk about luck, but every team needs luck. Even if you won 90 games or you won 95 games, right? And let's not act like the Mets and the Dodgers or the Yankees are that much better than one another or much better than, say, the Mets. How many more games did the Mets lose? How many wins did those two teams have, the Dodgers and the Yankees? 4 or 5 more wins than the Mets? It's not like the Mets were an 89-win team and the Dodgers were a 105-win team, or the Yankees were a 105-win team. And you talk about luck. This team, they didn't have 2 good months to sneak into the playoffs like the Phillies did in 2022 or the Diamondbacks did in 2023. They had just over 100 games of being one of the best teams in baseball. That's not a coincidence of just luck. Now, obviously, because the Mets made 2015, you fall into that category of thinking that team was better than 2024. You're rudely mistaken. All the 2015 Mets had was pitching. You had Ruben Tejada, who was your shortstop. You had a broken David Wright at third base. You had Daniel Murphy, who was a solid player, who had a great postseason. You had Yoenis Cespedes, who was a no-show, who had really, really one great month and a half in the season when he came to the Mets. You had Juan Lagares as your center fielder. You had Lucas Duda playing first base. That team was not better. Sorry to say. It was not. You can say whatever you want about that, but go back. They won that division by winning one more game than this team did. One more game. Yet, when they got to the NLCS, they were the road team. When they were in the NLDS, they weren't even the better team than the Dodgers. And if you go back to 2015, they were tremendous underdogs against the Cubs and the Dodgers. Yet, they were division winners. They weren't even a wild card team because the division wasn't that good. At least you could say this year that the Phillies were one of the best teams in baseball all year. Right? The Braves made the playoffs. Right? And you want to make excuses for the other teams, but not make excuses for the Mets, like the Mets had their ace all year. They did not. They lost their two of their biggest pieces in the bullpen in Raley and Smith. You had Diaz coming off of a major knee injury. Right? You don't want to talk about that because you don't want to give the Mets any credit. And you talk about luck. Luck is stupid to talk about when you can talk about that with every team. Right? The Dodgers should be in the World Series. I don't care about their injuries because if they didn't make the World Series, that would have been the excuse they made. You don't spend $1 billion and then talk about injuries. Right? Because you still had Ohtani, you still had Mookie Betts, you still had Freddie Freeman, 3 guys who were MVPs in Major League Baseball at one point. And again, explosive. I never said they didn't have luck. Yeah, exactly. But the Braves and Dodgers, you could have even attested that were better than the Mets. Don't tell me they weren't because the Braves won without Acuna in 2021. So that excuse is irrelevant. You can't win the World Series without Acuna. And you did it with Duvall. You did it with Soler. Come on. Like you can't win the World Series without Acuna and then complain about that you didn't have Acuna. That's silly. If it wasn't for the hurricane, it was okay. So the Mets don't get credit for basically traveling all over the place, right? Don't tell me that the Mets had an advantage there because they did not. They didn't. They really didn't. They were traveling in 2 weeks more. They must have traveled over 6,000 miles in a week. So I don't want to hear it while the Braves basically stood home for all that time. Now, you might be right. We might have lost those games against the Braves. That's very possible. But it ended up we didn't. So what was the excuse for the Arizona Diamondbacks? They could have easily won a couple of games. They only needed to win a couple of games against a Padres team that wasn't playing for nothing. The Braves were playing for something. The Diamondbacks could have easily took that third wild card spot. They didn't. That's on them. Yeah, explosive, but they didn't. That's the thing, right? The Diamondbacks had an opportunity, including the Braves, by the way, of winning more games than they did. Before the Braves faced the Mets, they could have won more games before and after. They didn't. The Diamondbacks, the same thing. The Diamondbacks collapsed. That's on the Diamondbacks. That's not on the Mets. The Mets could have easily collapsed, and we all know it, right? They still had to win games. Remember, after that Braves series, who was it? It was the Phillies, right? The Phillies were still trying to win a division. The Mets took 3 out of 4. We had to win against the Brewers. We pulled one out of our hats, but it was because the Diamondbacks lost against the Padres team that wasn't playing for nothing. They already had the number 1 seed locked up in the wild card. Okay, explosive. So there you go. So don't blame the Mets for another team choking. That's silly. Again, explosive. I don't care what you say when it comes to luck because that's ridiculous because every team needs luck. Every team needs luck. Are the Dodgers lucky that the Mets had their worst games in the NLCS in the postseason? The Dodgers are lucky there, right? Does that count or no? Oh, because they're supposed to be so good. You just told me they're so much better than the Mets. If that's the case, then they should have beat us in 4 games. Or at worst, 5 games. 2015 wasn't better. It was better because we got to the World Series, but the 2015 Mets faced worse teams in 2015 than they did this year. The Brewers were better than the 2 teams that they faced. Go back to 2015. The Cubs were still a very young team when they faced the Mets in 2015. And the Dodgers were on their last leg with all their veterans in 2015. They were not better than the Brewers. And the Cubs, look at them. They were just about to bloom into their rose because the following year they won the World Series. So they weren't as good. The Phillies were the second best team in baseball. The Brewers were they were a division winner. Right? We always forget about stuff like that. Explosive, who would win in 2015 or the 2015 Mets or the 2024 Mets? I'm going to tell you the 2024 Mets. Why? Because the Mets in 2015 had no MVP. They had no guy that hit over 36 home runs. They had better players. Lucas Duda over Pete Alonso. You'll take Pete Alonso every day of the week. Second base. Who was your second baseman? Daniel Murphy, who was a solid player but had a great postseason. Now, I'll give you Daniel Murphy as the better player over McNeil or Iglesias. You can choose. Lindor is tremendously a lot better than Ruben Tejada. Third base, a broken back David Wright over Vientos. Vientos is better. Left field, Brandon Nimmo. Left field, Yoenis Cespedes, who was garbage in the postseason. Brandon Nimmo actually had better numbers than Yoenis Cespedes in the postseason, and Brandon Nimmo was terrible. Center field, right? You want to bring up Bader or Tyrone Taylor? Let's bring up Tyrone Taylor. He started most of the games. He was better than Juan Lagares. Right field. right? Right field, Starlin Marte, he was better than anybody you put out there in right field. The Mets didn't even have basically a set lineup in 2015. Them guys weren't even as close to half of these guys on that team. Now, the pitching staff obviously was better. The 2015 Mets pitching staff was better. But that was it. Yeah. See, here's the issue. Terry Collins was never a good manager until he got to the Mets. He had 1.5 really good seasons. That's all Terry Collins had. Now, I'm not telling you that Mendoza is going to be better than Terry Collins, right? Terry Collins is the same one who left Matt Harvey out there in Game 5 of the World Series when it was clear that he should have took him out. Right? And you can also say the 2015 Mets got lucky for the Nationals choking, right? So you want to talk about luck. The 2015 Mets got lucky that the Nationals fell over themselves, right? Isn't that luck? Because before the deadline, the Mets were a 500 team in 2015, right? We can all agree to that, right? They didn't start taking off until after the deadline on August 1st. The Mets were already on their run right after May was over, right into June. The Mets didn't start going in 2015 until basically the deadline, 2 months after the 2022 Mets did. Yeah, explosive. Yes, they did. Because the Cubs weren't better than anybody in 2015. They were still very young. They were still a year behind. And if it wasn't luck in 2015, then why did Sandy Alderson say at spring training in 2015, yeah, we are a year away? So when you say that, it's luck. You can't say 2015 is lucky, but say 2024 was lucky when the players were much better, because they were. And if you want to say both years were lucky, I would be on board with you, because this year was supposed to be a transition year. The contracts told you that. But the players weren't better. Yeah, the rotation was better. Absolutely. But the rotation still didn't let the Mets win in the World Series. Right? They took the Dodgers to 5 games in the NLDS. They took the Phillies to 4 games. And the Phillies were much better than the Dodgers in 2015. The Dodgers were the best team in baseball. The Cubs weren't. Remember, the Mets had home field advantage against the Cubs in 2015. So if you believe that the Mets were underdogs in 2015 against the Cubs, they weren't. They had the home field advantage. And yeah, Ms. Cuzzy, exactly. I think it was more a couple of decision-making in this series against the Dodgers that I did blame Mendoza. I didn't like the lineup. Going into game 3, I didn't like starting Senga game 1. Yeah, that's on Mendoza. That's on the coaching staff. That's on David Stearns, because they all put this plan together. Well, yeah, explosive. I agree with that. 2024, I think 2015 and 2024, I think they're on path together as the most fun that I've been with, right? I only seen the Mets in the World Series twice, 2015 and 2000, when I was alive, since I've been alive. Right? A 2000 team that wasn't better than the 99 team. The 2016 Mets was probably better than the 2015 Mets roster-wise. Yet the 2016 team didn't get out of the wild card game. I could have said the 2022 Mets were better than 2015 and 2022, and they couldn't get out of a wild card. Right? You could say that about every team. I could say the Dodgers were better last year because their pitching staff was healthy, and they had a healthier roster last year. They didn't get to the World Series. They didn't win the World Series. The Dodgers have more of a depleted team this year than they did last year or the prior 2 years. Yet they still lost, and this year they made the World Series. What does that tell you? So it involves a lot of luck. right? The Braves won in 2021 because Soler, who was an afterthought that the Braves got, had an outstanding postseason. The same thing like Duvall. Were the Phillies lucky in 2022? I mean, they barely made the playoffs. They weren't better than any of the teams they faced, but they made the World Series and lost. So, do you want to make excuses for the Yankees? They played nobody in the postseason. They played a flawed Kansas City Royals team and a flawed Cleveland Guardians team that threw 2 starting pitchers in their series, in both series. Everything else was a bullpen game. So, we talk about luck. Were the Yankees going to make the World Series if they didn't play Kansas City and the Guardians? Maybe if it was either Astros or somebody better, at least in NLDS or the NLCS, maybe they wouldn't be here. It's supposed to, but again, if we have the magic, we don't win it. Why did we win in 2015? Because that was a hell of a lot of magic. I'm sorry, the team was not better. The roster wasn't better on paper. They faced inferior teams over what the Mets faced in 2024. That's a fact. The Mets faced all 3 division winners. All 3. All 3. And they also had to play another round in 2024 than they did in 2015. I wouldn't say Dodgers pitchers exposed us. Daniel, to be honest with you, if you look at their overall stats, they weren't good. The Dodgers pitching. It wasn't. You can say that the Mets kind of beat themselves without, I'm going to give the Dodgers credit because they did what they had to do to get to the World Series. But if you look, and you see where it says Mets NLCS notes, all in question marks, I'm going to give you 4 things in this series that basically killed the Mets. Well, Josh, and I'm going to get there with that. And I'm going to give you a crazy stat where you're going to be like, that's insane. Yeah, Chris, I agree with that. I agree with that. It was the issue of the fact that the Mets couldn't get out of their own way. But if you really look at it, the Mets had more people on base than the Dodgers in this series. The Dodgers scored 20 more runs than the Mets. And when I give you the stats that I'm going to show you in a little bit, you're going to see if the Mets would have been 10% better with men on base, just 10%. It didn't even have to be 50%. 10% better, the runs would have been basically even. That is the difference right there. That's the difference. It wasn't even the pitching that killed the Mets or the walks that killed the Mets. It was the execution when you had opportunities. That was the big thing, right? They had a bad offensive series. That's what killed us, right? So, and we're gonna get to it right now, guys. So make sure you hit on that like button, and we're gonna talk about the notes right here because it's gonna be very interesting. Agree, Explosive, 100%. No, I didn't. And Explosive, you were on the show yesterday on the post game. What did I say? I'm like, people are giving Alvarez credit for finally getting hits in game 5 and 6 when he left a total of 14 men left on base in the first 3 games. We lost 2 of those games, and Alvarez was a big reason why we lost those games. You can't leave 10 men left on and 7 in game, in game 2, and then he left 7 in game 1, and then he left 4 in game 2. Like, you can't do that. Game 3 was just as bad. When you leave nearly 14, 15 men left on base in the first 3 games, you can point just to that and say, wow, well, that was one of the biggest problems. It wasn't the only problem, Because if you really look back into it, the pitching wasn't that much better, or the pitching wasn't that much worse than what the Dodgers pitchers were. If you go back, the Dodgers struggled with their pitching as well. It's just that when the opportunities came, the Dodgers offense came through more than the Mets came through. And when I show you the stats and when I give you the notes here, you'll see why. And I'll tell you the difference. And the offense was the reason why the Mets lost this series. Wasn't the pitching. Because if you look at the overall stats, they're not that much different pitching-wise from both teams. Because the Dodgers walked a lot of guys as well. They put a lot of people on base. And the Mets had a tremendous amount of hits in this series. They just couldn't pull through with the big hit. Yeah, Explosive, I agree with you. I think Alvarez was one of the biggest problems. Right? We could talk about Iglesias and everything like that, but Alvarez was supposed to be a big part of this lineup. And he was probably the biggest problem. And yeah, Junior, you're right about that, right? The whole team left men on base, right? So the whole team. You could say Marte was the best player in the NLCS with run production-wise. He was the one that seemed like he got the big hit in this series. Right? Unfortunately, Marte forgot how to hit in the game that mattered in Game 6 because Marte left a ton of men left on base in this game, in Game 6. So, all right, guys. So we're gonna get through the notes here, and I'm gonna tell you why the hidden, because all this relates to why the Mets lost the NLCS. And again, this is putting to aside the credit we are gonna give the Los Angeles Dodgers because they get the credit for these stats, but the way it's like if the Mets didn't have opportunities and didn't have base runners, I would have leaned more towards the pitching being the problem for the Mets. But it ended up being the lack of production from the offense. So we're gonna start right here with I'm gonna put them in different order. I'm gonna go from the bottom and work my way up. So number 4, right, is right here. It is 213 average with runners on base. This is not runners in scoring position, right? I don't even look at that stat because runners in scoring position could be a little bit skewed because you could have a lot of 2 outs with runners in scoring position, and a sac fly doesn't help you there, obviously, right? I didn't look at runners in scoring position, and I give you the stat. They were batting under 200 with runners in scoring position, but it wasn't that many runners on base in scoring position. It was mostly people on base. Overall, that was the issue, right? They batted 213 with runners on. They batted under 200 with runners in scoring position. Runners in scoring position wasn't that big of a problem because we didn't have a lot of guys in scoring position. Yeah, we had a couple of bases loaded opportunities, but the Mets did have a lot of first and second. That was an issue, right? And it was less than 2 outs a lot of the times as well, which was another issue, right? They didn't have a lot of second and thirds with less than 2 outs. A lot of the times they had 2 outs with guys in second and third. Now you can talk about, and that's why I wanted to bring up the average with runners on as a total, because that's the problem, right? A base hit with first and second can probably score a guy from second. You know, a ball in the gap probably scores that guy from first, and you get the 2 runs. So the big thing here was the average with runners on that was used. And Explosive, I do agree with you. I said it from the moment I started the pregame in Game 3. The lineup should have Martinez. We could have talked about Alvarez. We could have talked about Iglesias or McNeil. Winker needed to be the DH the entire series. You don't play Winker in either of the first 2 games at home is crazy to me. And what annoyed me about Game 3 wasn't the fact that Mendoza went with Martinez and Iglesias over McNeil and Winker. it wasn't the decision as a whole. It's just that in this series, Game 3 should have been the easiest decision for Mendoza for the lineup because Walker Buehler had over a 900 OPS against left-handed batters, yet you left Jeff McNeil and Jesse Winker on the bench in that game and played two guys that were struggling in this postseason, in Iglesias and Martinez, and you put them in when the numbers told you that Walker Buehler has a lot of trouble this year with left-handers. And on top of that, Winker had great numbers against Buehler. So, yeah, I agree with you with that. That's why I was very upset with Mendoza, right? We can argue to the cows come home about Senga Game 1, right? I didn't like that decision. But when you really think about it, if you would have lost Game 1, because the Mets didn't score anyway in Game 1, if you would have used Manaea in Game 1, there would have been a pretty good chance that the Mets might have not actually had Manaea again in the series. You were able to pitch Manaea twice in this series. Now, Manaea didn't pitch well in Game 6 anyway, so it was kind of like, Manaea seemed like he was exhausted. So whenever he would have pitched again the second time, it might have not been enough anyway. All right, so that was the first thing. Runners on base, a 213 average. That was a killer for the New York Mets in this series, big time, right? That was the one thing where everybody's like, oh, why don't you talk about runners in scoring position? Because that only tells part of the story. When you have runners on base, and a lot of the times the Mets had runners on base, it was less than 2 outs. The Mets had 2 outs a lot more with runners in scoring position than they did with runners on base overall. So that's why I use that stat more, because when you have less than 2 outs and you have guys on base, even if it's guy on first with 1 out or no outs and stuff like that, they still were able to get people on base and they still couldn't bring in enough guys. How many times did they have bases loaded? How many times they had, first and second, nobody out, and they only scored 1 run? That was a killer. So there's the one thing that killed the Mets in this series, a 213 average runners on base. The next one is usually a flawed stat in general, because you can have a really big high scoring game in one game and then score nothing the next game, but overall you have a good average runs per game, which is the next one we're going to be looking at. Runs per game for the New York Mets was 4.3. Now, if you just have an open mind, 4.3 runs per game doesn't sound that bad. The Mets actually scored the major league average in the season, because the major league average for runs scored was basically, it was 4.35. The Mets scored 4.33. I just rounded it down. So the Mets scored 4.3 runs per game, but obviously that was skewed, right? Because they scored 7 runs in one game and 12 in the other, the 2 games they won. And that's why, if you really look at it, the offense was the big problem and why they lost. When they scored more than 6 runs, they won the ball game. That was what they did when they got the runners in, because their average was over 250 in both of the games they won with runners on base. 40-point difference. Huge difference. So runs per game. Well, explosive, of course Pete's going to explore free agency. He has Boris as his agent. Of course he is. I mean, if you don't know that, we don't need Martino to tell you that. He didn't sign an extension with the Mets. There would be no reason for him to sit down only with the Mets exclusively, because he can do that right now if he wants to until the World Series is over. And he also has 5 days after the World Series for the Mets to exclusively sit down with the Mets. The Mets can negotiate with him 5 days, the 5 days after the World Series. They have exclusive rights to do that with no other team talking to him. Of course he's going to go explore free agency. That's what he's going to do. If you didn't know that, then you're not paying attention. That's obvious. I don't need Martino to tell me that. I know Martino thinks he's smart, but he's really not. I mean, that's an obvious, report there. That's something that I knew from the moment Pete Alonso didn't take that offer from the Mets. And here's the two things, right? Number 4 and number 3. Number 4, 213 average with runners on, runs per game 4.3. Now, that is the average of Major League Baseball during the season. So the Mets were right on average. And before the NLCS, the Mets scored the most runs in the playoffs up until that point in the postseason. So with the wild card round and the NLDS, they had the most runs out of everybody, and that's the teams that won the wild card round and also the teams in the NLDS. So that's good. Yeah, explosive. I just think it's about money. I think I said this from the beginning. I think Pete Alonso is going to take the first big offer he's going to get that's not the Mets. That's just my opinion. I said that from day one. He can say whatever he wants. He loves the city, loves the fans, blah, blah, blah. Right? If you truly, truly cared about that, you could have took that offer. Because the season he had, now the postseason can help a little bit, but I mean, he probably is going to get it. Look, there's going to be a desperate team. It might be the Cubs. It might be the Mariners. And then people talk about, oh, why would Pete Alonso go to the Mariners? Look what they do. They spend money, but they choke every year. And then they say the Cubs. The Cubs are a team that, they've had trouble and they should have won the division this year. Right? It doesn't matter. Like, we get so caught up on, if the team is good. Go back to the Texas Rangers. The Texas Rangers, prior to winning the World Series, lost 95 games. Why did Seager go there? Why did DeGrom sign there? Right? If they were so bad and a 95-loss team, why did they go there? Right? Everybody talks about, why would a player go to a losing team? Because money is all that matters. We have a hard time getting that through our heads when it comes to players and thinking that they just want to go to a winning team and that's it. It's not the case at all. At all. The Texas Rangers lost 95 games the year before they won the World Series. They signed Seager and they signed DeGrom, amongst others. Marcus Semien. So they signed all those guys, yet they lost 95 games the year before they won the World Series. So it's not about a team losing. Why did all three of those guys go to Texas? Because Texas gave them the most money. That is it. The same reason Scherzer didn't go to the Dodgers 2 years ago and went to the Mets. Because the Mets gave him the extra year that Scherzer wanted. The Dodgers didn't. That's it. The Dodgers, we can all say, were better than the Mets after 2021. Why didn't Scherzer go there? Because they got the extra year and the extra money. Verlander could have easily stayed with the Astros by taking a little less money. The Astros weren't better than the Mets. They just came off a World Series. Why didn't Verlander go back to the Astros when the Astros were clearly the better team? Why is that? Because Verlander took more money. It's very simple. We're making this harder than it actually is. The player is going to the most money. This is not a breaking news scenario here. This is common sense. There's very little guys that take less money, and usually the best players take the most money, right? Aaron Judge, in my opinion, was a unique situation because I don't think he ever wanted to leave the Yankees. That's a different story. I never truly believe that Pete Alonso actually wants to be a Met, stay a Met. I think the Aaron Judge, people are bringing up Aaron Judge, he took less. Yeah, absolutely. but he was also going to be paid at that time as the highest average annual player in baseball at that time. Obviously, Juan Soto is going to beat that this year. But at the moment, Aaron Judge was making the most per year as that contract. Pete Alonso is not going to make that at all. That's the problem that the Mets and Pete Alonso are going to have. Pete Alonso thinks he should be the highest paid first baseman in baseball, but he won't be. Because it's not about the years and the total contract. It's about the average annual value per year. That's what players look at. That is the issue when it comes to Pete Alonso, right? Aaron Judge was the best player in baseball the year he became a free agent. Pete Alonso had his worst year of his career. Big difference. That is the issue that a lot of Met fans are not going to understand, right? I don't expect Pete Alonso to take less to come back to the Mets, and I don't think the Mets should overpay to keep Pete Alonso. I think that's a flawed plan. Because if he was that important to this team, why he wasn't top 5 in the guys who got us to this point, got us to the playoffs. Now, when he got to the playoffs, he played well. But if you really look at his overall stat, now, again, if he didn't hit that home run, we wouldn't have beat the Brewers, right? Who knows if we would have beat the Phillies? Who knows if we would have got to game 6 of the NLCS, right? Couple of home runs. But he didn't do that much better after that. So the issue with Pete Alonso is that he believes, or maybe Boris is putting it in his head, that he's the best first baseman in baseball. Now, power doesn't mean everything. And I keep on telling people that, right? Stop looking at only the power. Then if you're going to look at the power, you have to look at 2024 as power for Pete Alonso, which was one of his worst seasons power-wise, minus 2020. Yeah, well, I honestly think, and this is just my opinion, right? I think John Heyman was in bed with Aaron Judge. I think that was planned all along, to be quite honest with you. Because John Heyman, he's a reporter, right? Reporters are wrong more often than they're right. So it wasn't going to hurt John Heyman's career. John Heyman's career took off even more after that tweet. He started to work more for MLB Network. So it's not like he lost his career or his job. It basically jump-started it more, right? I truly believe that John Heyman and Boris, or I'm sorry, not Boris, the agent of Judge and Aaron Judge, I thought this was a huge plan because the Yankees were not going to pay what they felt like they didn't. Just think this. Judge, who was the best player in baseball, MVP, the Yankees didn't believe that he was worth all that money that they eventually gave him. They didn't think that. They didn't believe that. It took to the last minute and second for Judge to get what he wanted per year to make that happen, right? Everybody was like, oh, the Padres, the Giants, they gave him more money. They gave him more years. They didn't give him more average annual value. The Yankees did. But overall, it was a lesser contracts than what the Padres offered and what the Giants offered. So, if you're going to say that Aaron Judge took less money overall contract-wise, yes. But with the value average per year was more. He was the highest paid player, annual average value, as a position player and in baseball. So there you go. So they, exposed. You could say, I wish Judge left. Yeah, great. He would have been in the National League. That helped the Mets. No, I'd rather have him as a Yankee because he doesn't really necessarily hurt the Mets more than he would have in the National League. Right? And, with Judge not having a great postseason yet again, if it wasn't for Juan Soto, the Yankees would never be where they are, to be quite honest with you. Because Judge didn't have a good postseason. He hit one big home run against the Guardians and that was basically it. Juan Soto basically carried the Yankees into the World Series. If they didn't have Juan Soto, then they wouldn't be where they're at. And Yankee fans won't even acknowledge that. But it's a fact. The Yankees have played terrible baseball in this postseason. Bad base running, bad defense. Their batting average is terrible. Runners in scoring position and runners on base. Juan Soto has been their best player. And that's why when people are like, oh, I'm not going to pay Juan Soto all that money, that's crazy. The guy performs in the postseason. We got to stop worrying about the season so much when all you got to do is make the playoffs and get into a wild card. Divisions are nice, right? We all want to win a division, but get into the playoffs. I want guys who perform in the postseason. That's the guys I want to sign. That's the guys I want to go after. I don't want to go after guys that have great regular seasons that have terrible postseasons, right? It might help us to get to the playoffs, but when you need those guys the most, they don't show up, right? So, that's why when I'm like, all right, Pete Alonso had a nice postseason, right? Big home runs. And I would be willing to go to a certain point money-wise and years-wise with Pete Alonso, but I'm not going to go overboard because he is not the best first baseman, and we've seen it play out. He's not better than Olsen. He's not better than Freddie Freeman. Freddie Freeman's a better player with one leg than Pete Alonso is overall. And this is not a shot at Pete Alonso. It's just a fact. Pete Alonso doesn't deserve more money than Olsen and Freeman, even with money increases by contract. Seems like every year. So you're gonna have guys making more money than the guy that they're not better than, but it's the overall. It's the average annual value. That's where you get a little crazy. So. Yeah, Victor, I do apologize for that. It is going in and out. I do apologize for that. Also, I have no voice. I'm screaming, so it's probably not helping the mic catching my voice because I have no voice because I've been sick the last week or 4 days or so. Yeah, easy, exactly. Stanton has been their best player, right? Overall, right? It's not even the guy who's getting paid the most money this year. Judge is getting $40 million per year. Soto's getting 31, and Stanton's getting 29, 32, whatever it is. So, and that's the thing. Yeah, I feel like an opportunity because I'm trying to scream to project my voice because if I talk normal, you guys won't even hear me. So, I do apologize for that. But I'm trying to raise my voice so you can actually hear me, and it's kind of crackling the mic a little bit. Sorry, Victor. That's fine. It's not Pete's slander. It's just a fact. Pete Alonso's not better than those players, and Pete Alonso, along with Scott Boras, is going to want more money than both of those players got. And he might get it because there's desperate teams out there. The Mets are not desperate to bring back Pete Alonso. I'm sorry to say that might piss off Met fans, but it's a fact, right? You don't have an idiot GM that wants to, just appease the fans. And this is the problem that I think Mets front office people fell into. I think that they fell for, we can't get rid of Pete Alonso because the fans love him. That's a stupid way to do business. All right, you can't tell me, you can say, hey, the Mets choked. Pete Alonso was a part of that choke in 2022. Why does nobody bring up Pete Alonso with that? 2023, Pete Alonso, if you look besides August and September of last year in 2023, he was not very good when it mattered. So we can look at it a lot of different ways. But the fact is, I don't want to give Pete Alonso, if it takes the Mets to pay $200 million for Pete Alonso, regardless of the years, if it takes $200 million to get Pete Alonso, he's not going to be a Met. I'm just going to let you know that right now. Because you got David Stearns that isn't stupid enough to give him that type of contract. There's a reason why Pete Alonso had the lowest amount of home runs in his career that is not 2020. The reason why he had the lowest RBIs in his career. His average was one of the worst in his career. That is not a coincidence. It's not just the pressure of a contract. People talked about his swing. People talked about his approach. People talked about his age, where they believe that those things are going to get worse over time, not better. This is not a 25-year-old like a Juan Soto. Pete Alonso was never the best player in baseball, like Aaron Judge, at the same age that Pete Alonso was as a free agent. Big differences here. You pay the guy who was an MVP the year he became a free agent. You do that. Because that year, there was no signs of him slowing down at the same age that Pete Alonso is a free agent. Yeah, George, that might be a possibility. You might move Vientos to first base. If you look, he actually played first base a decent amount in spring training. And when Pete missed a few games, Vientos could play first base. Remember, he was doing it in practice as well. So, yeah, well, easy. That's the thing, right? I think the Mets are going to go a little bit higher than their original offer. What was it? 6 years, 170 something? I think they might go 6 years, 185. I don't think they're going to go beyond that. Or maybe 7 years, 180. I don't even think they're going to go to 7 years. I think they're going to go 6 years, 175 to 180. I wouldn't go more than that. I'm sorry. I'm not. This guy is not never an MVP. He isn't the best player in baseball. He's not even close to the best player in baseball. He still isn't a top 10 player, which, he was at one point. I thought he would be, but he never turned out to be that. Power alone is not showing me enough. All right? You don't bat 270, 280. You don't, the RBIs are there, but it just feels like Pete Alonso doesn't do enough during the season to propel his team, right? Pete Alonso basically had mostly nothing to do with the Mets making the playoffs this year. Now, he was much better in the postseason, and yes, you got to take that into account when giving him a contract. But you were supposed to be our best player, right? Lindor was supposed to be number 2, and it turned out that Pete Alonso was basically, 5th on the list as guys who had the better season for the Mets? That you have to take into consideration as well. Explosive, you said that the Mets need another slugger. Tommy Edman was the NLCS MVP. All right, it wasn't Ohtani, it wasn't Betts, it wasn't Freeman, it wasn't Teoscar Hernandez, it wasn't Will Smith. It was Tommy Edman. Ken, you could talk about those numbers all you want. 45 home runs, 120 RBIs. Wonderful. But again, how many of those home runs and RBIs during the season really actually mattered? Because again, I talk about this all the time. It was the clutch moments of Pete Alonso that was the big issue during the season. Now, listen, I put more in what Pete Alonso did in the postseason than what he's done in the regular season. So I'm willing to go the extra $10 to $15 to $20 million overall contract because of what Pete Alonso did for us in the postseason. Right? I think that matters. But he wasn't in the top 5 as a team, as a player that helped us to get to the postseason this year. But I take into account what he did in this postseason for us. But I'm not giving him $200 million. I'm just not doing that. Sorry. I'm just not. I don't think he's good enough to be worth that much more money. It's just not. All right, so we're going to go with the number 2 reason with the New York Mets, and it's right here. 26 total runs in the NLCS in 6 games. The Dodgers scored 46. 20 run difference. Now, again, this is all going to make sense once we get to that number one thing. And this is why we're almost an hour in. Even though we skewed off a little bit because of what people are talking about in the comments, and we wanted to bring that up as well. Right? 26 total runs in the NLCS. Now, that falls in line with the runs per game, 4.3 runs per game in this series for the Mets. But 26 total runs. They got shut out twice, and that didn't help the situation. But they could have scored 4 or 5 runs in both of those games and still lost the game. So you could say, yeah, total runs, it was a problem, but it was when they scored the runs that were the much interesting problem that they had in this series because of the fact that they got shut out twice. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Oof, still going through it, guys. Apologize for that. So 26 total runs. Why talking about that, but not really going deep into that conversation of the 26 total runs? Why? Because the number one thing is staggering. And if you watch this series throughout, you kind of have an idea that the Mets left a lot of guys on base. So I was curious because, I was curious of how many guys did they leave on base? All right. It's a staggering number. And here it goes. 122 guys left on base. That is not a typo. I checked it 3 times. 122 men left on base. Now, they scored 26 runs, right? So in total, they had 148 guys on base in this series. They scored 26. So there were 26 for 148 in this series were runners on base. That's a staggering number. The Dodgers overall left 102 men left on base. Overall. Oh, I'm sorry. They had 102 people on base. They scored 46 runs. So it's near a 50% clip of them getting runners on and them scoring. It was nearly 50%. The Mets were barely 20%. If the Mets just have 10% more of runs scored in this series, they might have been a lot closer in winning games, if not winning the games that they lost. That's the difference in this series. The Mets scored 20 less runs. And with the left on base, the Mets left 20 more than the Dodgers. That's the difference of a game. That's the difference of a series right there. And that's why the offense was the biggest problem in this series. We could talk about the pitching, but again, go back to the Dodger pitching. If you look at their stats overall, it's not that much worse than the Mets. They've walked a ton of guys as well. But the Dodgers capitalized on those walks. The Mets did not do it enough in this series. The New York Mets left 122 men left on base. They were 26 for 148 in this series, while the Dodgers were 46 for 110. Oh, for 105, excuse me. That's the difference. The Dodgers basically scored half their runs that they put on base. The Mets scored just over 20% of the runners that they had on base. They had nearly 30 men more on base than the Dodgers did, yet the Dodgers scored 20 more runs. They were more efficient with the men on base. The Mets weren't. So we can talk about the pitching, which should have been better. But when you put the stats together with the Mets and the Dodgers, the overall stats, not just one stat. You can give me one stat telling me that the Dodgers were better than the Mets. Obviously. If you put the stats together, overall pitching stats, it wasn't that much of a difference. What was different and staggering difference was the offense. Scoring 20 less runs was the difference in this series. If the Mets scored 10% of those 122 men on base, just 10 more percent of that, the runs per game or the runs total in this NLCS would be different. And it could have won a Mets another game, and you might have been talking about a game 7 anyway, because they would have pulled out one more game in their series. Maybe it would have been game 1, maybe it would have been game 3, maybe it would have been game 4, possibly even game 6, as the Mets did score 5 runs, which was what they did in their runs per game in this series. But Ken, it's not meaningless stats. How is that meaningless stats when that's basically the way they lost? They're not duh facts. They left way too many men left on base. When the Dodgers, basically 50% of the runners on base came around to score, and the Mets had just over 20% of their 148 overall scoring, it's a 20% difference. Barely. That was the issue. So, yeah, Kevin, exactly my point. The Dodgers were better offensively. Again, the overall look, I was just as surprised when I looked at the overall pitching numbers between the Dodgers and the Mets. I thought it wasn't going to be close. I thought the Dodgers were going to be well ahead of us, pitching-wise, overall. That includes starters and bullpen. Yet, it was surprisingly closer than I thought. Because look, the Mets already lost, right? I went into the stats looking with an open mind. Because why wouldn't I? There's no bias here anymore. The Mets are out. So I went into that. And the pitching was a lot closer than I thought. And I was like, that's crazy. But then when I looked at the offensive stats, it's like, wow. It wasn't, I knew it was bad, but it was a lot worse than I thought. And it's like, damn, if they did a little bit more, not much more, they didn't have to go a 50% clip of scoring 50% of their runs that they had on base. All they had to do was get to like 30, 32%. And it would have been a tremendous amount of difference. Now, would they still would have won the series? It would have been close. But a game you lost, 10-5, with all the runners they left on base in that game, in game 6, it might have been a closer game. We talk about in-game momentum in a game. That can change outcomes, right? When the Dodgers scored, it changed momentum in a game. Even though the Mets, made it a little bit interesting, they continued to score. So, yeah, it sucks. Unfortunately, Ken, to your lips to God's ears, to be quite honest with you. Like, I'm not going to have a quote-unquote rooting interest, but, again, the Yankees are finally facing a team that's actually good in the postseason. Now, again, can the Yankees sneak by and find a way to win? Sure. It's baseball. Yeah, Kevin, exactly, right? The Mets dominate the Dodgers in the NLDS, and the NLCS goes to the Dodgers. It's crazy. So, it is what it is, right? The Dodgers overall were the better team in this series. That's a fact. The Mets did not play well. So, there you go, guys. The NLCS notes for the New York Mets is heavily all about the offense, because the offense was staggering how bad it actually was. 122 men left on base, 26 total runs, 4.3 runs per game, and a 213 average with runners on base. There's the outcome. And before we get done with this stream, the free agent list, I'm not going to get into keeping, not keeping, keeping, not keeping. That's going to be a totally another stream. a total another stream by itself after the World Series. But these are the free agents. The Mets have two guys in Sean Manaea and Phil Maton. One has a player opt out, and the other one has a team option. Sean Manaea has a player option. Phil Maton is a team option. So that's the only two that kind of matters when it comes to the player and team. The free agent list, as you can see, it's Alonso, Bader, Fujinami, Iglesias, Martinez, Ottavino, Raleigh, Severino, Smith, Stanek, and Winker. So that is all the possible free agents for the Mets, and there'll be a stream by its lonesome self about who I would keep. I'll talk about possible contracts later after the World Series. Me and Chris, we've been talking about it already. We're going to do a series recap. It's looking like it's a season recap, a season recap for the New York Mets. We're going to probably do it on Thursday prior to the World Series, and we're going to give grades for the manager. We're going to give manager to the entire roster, the final roster that we've seen over the last week of the season, because the roster in April wasn't the same roster you have in October, obviously, and even late September. So whatever the roster was ending the year into the postseason is the roster we're going to give grades on. So that's it. And yes, Quintana as well. You know what's funny? I apologize. Yeah, Quintana. I thought I had Quintana. I guess not. Okay, I'm sorry about that. So yeah, Ken, thank you for putting that up. So I had Quintana, and I'm looking at my side panel over here, and I didn't sneak it in. So yeah, Quintana as well. That's my bad. Quintana as well. I thought I had Quintana. I think the Ottavino thing got me freaking confused, which is sad because Quintana is a hell of a lot better than Ottavino. So Ottavino as well. Oh, I see. I had it in my notes, but that's on me. So Quintana as well. So all those guys are free agents or possible free agents. Obviously, Manaea could be a free agent if he opts out, which you expect him to. And we don't think the Mets are going to take the team option on Phil Maton, but who knows, right? So, guys, that is a postseason wrap. Going over the NLCS. It was a great run while it lasted. They ran into the best team in baseball, and they couldn't do it. They couldn't get over the hump. That sucks. That does suck. But it is what it is. You take what you can out of it, and you hope that the experience certain guys got is going to help you down the road, along with the additions or subtractions that you will have in this offseason to make this team hopefully have aspirations, because now, to be quite honest, there's expectations now. My expectation going into next year is get where you end your season. That's the way I always feel. Your goal after the year before, if you got to the NLCS like the Mets did in 2024, 2025, you at least have to get back to the NLCS. That should be a guarantee. That's what you need to do, right? Things happen. It's baseball, it's sports. But I'm not going to be satisfied if we don't get to the NLCS. Now, winning it's another story. But the minimum should be getting back to the NLCS. I think that's fair to say. So, unfortunately, the Mets run came up short. They were 2 games from the World Series, 6 games overall of winning the World Series, but it just wasn't enough. Unfortunately for us Mets fans, we have to watch the Dodgers and the Yankees. That probably is not the best situation for us. But with that said, guys, thank you for tuning in to the last of the 2024 season Mets Talk Live. It was a great season. It was a fun season. You guys came along for the ride. Appreciate all the support and the back and forth throughout the season. Off-season talk will be happening right after the World Series. Season recap is happening on Thursday with me and Chris. We're going to give full grades to the entire roster and manager. So make sure you tune in for that. It will be a live show. With that said, guys, everybody have a great night. As always, Met fans, let's go Mets. And we'll see you on Thursday for the season recap live stream with me and Chris. Have a good night, guys, and let's go Mets.
in the dead of night, full of echo. Concrete jungle, dreams bust to grow. Mets in the air, chase glory, no fear. Broken backs, but hearts steer clear. OMG, the chaos, what a scene. Streets buzzing like a machine. Grimace from the shadows, chills on my spine. Past haunts, the future shine. Come back to the night, keep dreams alive.